Kingdom Polemics exists to equip the church for battle against the kingdom of darkness in light of the particular threats of our day. Kingdom Polemics is about taking the cosmic, Christological concepts of the Scottish Reformed and connecting it to the ground. Welcome to Kingdom Polemics. Just a brief reminder about the opportunity to give support financial to the podcast, the platform. It's Buy Me a Coffee. A lot of times you probably don't see this put underneath there at the end every time. You got the little scan code or whatnot, but just keep that in mind. We do appreciate and need the help, whatever minimal it is. But that said, we are here, and Benjamin is back again. We've had probably 3 or 4 conversations on here. He's my fellow ARP pastor, covenanter, and all those good things. And we're going to have a discussion today about Kevin DeYoung and his article for the Gospel Coalition about the fact, or the alleged fact, that the 1788 Westminster Standards, when they speak to the magistrate, they are opposing views. There is no way to synthesize and embrace both of them. For you to believe what the 1788 Westminster Standards say about the civil government means that what was said previously in that same section is something that you no longer can hold to. They're not reconcilable. They're antithetical. And so before we jump around and get into various points, just remind folks of who you are and where you are. We know you're in the ARP. And after you introduce yourself, why don't you start our conversation off with, when you read this article about the standards and the point of magistrate, what was your response? Like, how did you take it, and what was your knee-jerk response? So a little brief bio, and what was your first response as you read this article by DeYoung?
Well, again, my name is Benjamin Glasser. I'm pastor at Bethany ARP Church on the west side of Clover, South Carolina. What I like to say to people is that it's still rural South Carolina on this side of Charlotte, but not very much longer. So we take advantage of what we can right now. The reaction I had when I first read this is this article would have been a big shock to Charles Hodge, to A.A. Hodge, to pretty much anybody who was a Southern Presbyterian outside of maybe Stuart Robinson. But even Stuart Robinson would have some issues with the false dichotomy that DeYoung presents, not just in the irreconcilability of 1646 and 1788, but this whole idea that clergy and the church is not allowed to either hold nor promote political morality, if you want to use that term. Even Witherspoon himself, and of course, DeYoung is a Witherspoon scholar of sorts. Witherspoon was not just a clergyman, but he was a signer and an active participant in the formation of the American state. And so Witherspoon, even in his own biography, seems to somewhat violate the principles that DeYoung would like to lay forth. And so the more that this conversation unfolds, the stranger it gets to me in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all thoughts that I actually had when I was reading through the article. But here was my knee-jerk thought, and it's not as sophisticated and theological. It's a little less that. My knee-jerk response was the Gospel Coalition is telling us about a piety or spirituality that necessarily radically separates the spheres when it comes to religion of church and state. So Gospel Coalition is, I know they have different authors, and I know that not everything is, they do sometimes present different sides of the conversation, but there is a common stream. There is a thread that you can see the pattern. So the Gospel Coalition is basically saying that Reformed Christianity and the state, they don't cooperate in this co-Christocentric allegiance to Christ. They don't. And what I found ironic is how so much of the Gospel Coalition's content is bringing this fusion of ideology that is in the state, in the spirituality of the church. Everything that the state is doing, or the present state that is doing that is leftist. A lot of the things that they're about is gospel. Like the immigration conversation is gospelized, and the Black conversation in America is gospelized. So to me, it was humorous. I know that this would not be representative of DeYoung, but it was humorous that this entity that is promoting this separation of spirituality and temporal and civil is constantly infusing state ideology in the spirituality church, to the point where we're talking about COVID and with this gospel language. And so
right.
I thought it was humorous. And I also thought, like, why is any, I'm just a simple man. Why is a guy promoting orthodoxy writing for an entity that is trying to make the Barbie movie some kind of Christocentric moral story and softening, homosexuality? I just was, it was a bit ironic to me. But I don't want to go, this is not going to be like a Gospel Coalition bashing session. This is to go into the substance of the article. But to me, like, Gospel Coalition is the least legitimate entity to separate spheres very well. But whenever it's interesting, when spirituality, when ideology from the state gets kind of mixed in with the church, they're all happy about it. When Christianity gets mixed into the state, they get very uncomfortable about it, right? So it's all fine to bring BLM and the political machines of BLM and leftism and the powers that be. It's all fine to bring that into the spiritual church, but God forbid that we would bring the fourth commandment into that realm. And to me, it just seems inconsistent. So here's the first quote. We'll start with a few quotes. So it says and I don't have the article scroll through. I just pulled the quotes out. As new debates about the proper relationship between church and state continue to multiply, it's important to recognize the two versions of the Westminster 23.3 represent two different and irreconcilable views of the civil magistrate. Okay, another quote. In short, what the Westminster Assembly confessed in London about the civil magistrate in 1646 is not what American Presbyterians confessed in Philadelphia in 1788. The two versions of the Westminster Confession don't say the same thing. They cannot both be right. Now, one thing I wanted to comment about this, is it fair to say that there is substantial difference in 23 from London to Philadelphia? Is it fair to say there is differences? Would you say there is?
It's fair to say there's differences, but one of the things that I find that's consistently missed in a lot of the conversation around this is that in 1788, as the confession is being altered and changed, one of the things being taken into account is the different civil political structure in the United States versus what was in offer in 1647 in, the British system. And so everybody's having to kind of figure out what it means to be a national denomination in a federal republic. And so, Witherspoon, of course, he good friends with James Madison, and Madison, has certain ideas about this. Of course, other founders have different ideas about, again, the relationship between the federal state and the local government, whether it be state or otherwise. And so when you start asking questions about who the magistrate is in the American colonies, you're not necessarily going to say that the president of the United States should have the same authority as the king does in England, Scotland, and Ireland. And so if you miss that distinction, you're going to miss some of the kind of nuances of how men who are confessing the Westminster Confession of Faith, as it's modified in 1788, and how they're going to take that to the local level. Because again, as we see in history, these guys, ministers in the Presbyterian Church, are going to advocate for the civil magistrate in South Carolina or North Carolina or Virginia or wherever to take not just moral stands, but to apply the law of God to the civil sphere.
Yeah.
And so it seems antithetical in his words, to say that the spirit of 1788 and 1647 are so radically different that they can't even say the same thing, when you see many ministers advocating for the state to use the sword to impose, not just second table commandments, but first table commandments. I mean, you have blasphemy laws on the book. You have Sabbath laws on the book. You even have, while not strictly establishment, you have certainly laws against anti-Christian sects taking up root. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially into the early part of the 19th century, as you see all of the wild and crazy burned over district religions that come out of Western New York, the Mormons being the most well-known, it's the civil magistrate that runs them out of Western New York. It's the civil magistrate that runs them out of Ohio, into Indiana, into Illinois. So, yes, in kind of a broad sense, right, there's some disagreement, but practically, the men who lived in the day were still interested in seeing the civil magistrate apply his power to assist the church.
Yeah, that's really good. So I heard a few things there. The first thing I heard is the difference in language does not necessarily, it cannot necessarily be reduced to simply their theology change radically on this matter. What you're saying is that the radical difference in the political environment and its application had a lot to do with the difference of language. So it's not so much our doctrines have radically changed, but we're in a different place with a different political way of functioning, and our adaptation to that demands for changes. That's interesting. I've never even thought of that point very deeply, but more indirectly. And the second thing that you said is, if you want to know how these men, what they meant by this language changing, then see how they carried themselves, see how Christians carried themselves, and see how pastors carried themselves and spoke in this time period. And so what do they mean by this language changing? Well, listen to what they said about civil things, and you'll get a good idea. And so that we'll definitely get more into that. But that's a huge point. Right? Even when we look into some of the GAs, and you see things that the General Assembly and the Southern Presbyterian Church and the things they said, they were not making statements that were representative of voluntarism, right? So that's really good. But another thing that he does in this article that's interesting is he then moves to Gillespie. He cites Gillespie, and this is what he says. Interesting. Moving on to a different point of the conversation. Gillespie's views on the civil magistrate, if not entirely convincing to every member of the assembly, represented the two kingdom thinking that have been dominant in Scotland for 3/4 of the century. So what I wanted to highlight that is what I noticed about DeYoung. Have you been following DeYoung and how he's been talking about Scottish two kingdom theology in America? Have you followed any of those conversations?
Not super closely, but I know he's continued to try to broaden out what the men in Scotland said.
Yeah. So this is my impression from various things that I've heard him say, and even what is somewhat inferred here is that the American modern 2K theology that we have actually truly captures the heart of Scottish 2K theology. And this little comment, Gillespie's views on 2K, I mean, they were there, but it wouldn't be the consensus, is one of those statements that I've heard amongst many, which the idea is that we Americans, we truly encapsulate and capture Scottish 2K.
Mm-hmm.
They what they were intending, we have blossomed. Have you gotten any? Have you followed that track of thinking with DeYoung and
Well,
others?
I mean, that's consistent with a lot of things in America, to put it generally. Yeah, Americans have long thought of themselves as the perfecters of the European tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, going all the way back to our founding.
You're saying that's not just ecclesiological. That's just
no. I mean, it's a cultural thing. You know, we brought John Locke to his logical conclusion in Philadelphia. You know, we took the English common law tradition and brought it to its logical conclusion in the U.S. Constitution. And of course, American exceptionalism is often something people talk about, but I mean, it's just part of our spirit, right? That Americans, have reached kind of the intellectual zenith, and everybody else needs to just follow after us. One of the ways you see this is the way that the term theological seminary has been imported back into Europe and back into other countries, right? The Free Church College famously has been changed to Edinburgh Theological Seminary. Well, theological seminary doesn't make any sense in Europe, right? It's kind of a strange term. But again, Americans have gone back and taken our language with us, and in some sense have imposed our language on others. Mm-hmm. It kind of, which is again ironic, considering a big concern of Gospel Coalition is so-called cultural imperialism. But we as Americans are very good at trying to kind of arrogantly say that that we've moved past old Europe. And this is just another form of that in many ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the more, what I noticed, the more I get underneath this kind of theology that's claiming to be preserving the distinct spirituality of the church, the more I peel back the layers and think about it, the more it seems very American. It's more American than it is, I think, spiritual or textual, right? And so even like the point that like we really get those guys and what they're really about. So it's interesting. On the one hand, there is this continuity. Hey, their 2K, they were there, but like they kind of stumbled over themselves. We got it. So there's this continuity narrative, but then there's like this discontinuity narrative. So it's interesting. Like, we're different, but we're the same. And I guess you have to do that because if you're confessional, you're trying to make a case for why you're standing on history.
Sure.
Right. But Gillespie is cited for 2K, but it's funny how I hear a lot of guys, they cite Gillespie's 2K and they don't really cite Gillespie talk about 2K. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes from Gillespie.
Mm.
Both magistrate, this is from Ehrman's Rod Blossoming, both magistrate and ministry are appointed for the glory of God as supreme and for the good of men as a subordinate end. They are both of them mutually aiding and auxiliary each to each other. Magistrate strengthens ministry and ministry strengthens magistrate. So there you have it. Distinction, but Christological cooperation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another quote of him is interesting. If it be objected, how can these things agree with what which have been before us acknowledged? The civil magistrate ought to take special care of religion. So basically he's saying, like, how do you process this distinction with this religious ethos in the state? Of the conservation and purgation thereof, of the abolishing idolatry and superstition, and out of all these Latin terms, of the first as well as the second table, I answer that the magistrates are appointed not only for civil policy, but for the conservation and purgation of religion, as expressed in the Confession of Faith and the Church of Scotland before cited. We must firmly believe as the most undoubted truth. But when divines make the object of magistracy to be only such things as belong to this life and a human society, they do not mean the object of the magistrate's care, as if he were not able to take care of religion, but the object of his operation. The magistrate himself may not assume the administration of the keys nor dispensation of the church censures. He can but punish the external man with external punishments. So basically, just be saying, you guys assume that when we say that the magistrate is about things temporal in this life, that demands that he cannot be about religion. He cannot be a, what is it, the circus sacro, right? Says, no, we're simply saying that there is a difference in the object of his operation, but not the religiousness of it, right?
Right.
So what I find interesting is with a lot of guys like DeYoung and just in this sphere of people, they see the Calvin language about civil and temporal and spiritual, eschatological, common matters, and they hear that, and they fail to continue to hear how those distinctions are not saying voluntarism. They're not saying principal pluralism. They're just simply speaking about the distinction of how the magistracy is to be about Christ. But it's not speaking about this purely atheistic, agnostic temporal realm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key things that I don't know whether it's purposeful or whether it's mistaken or just lazy or what it is. But, this idea that Witherspoon and other guys who helped to formulate the 1788 confession would have been okay with, mosques being set up on every corner and, Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on people's doors and things of that nature. Just, it doesn't comply with what they actually did and what they actually wrote. And so, as you said, you kind of get in this situation where these guys are projecting their own understanding of principal pluralism onto guys who would never in a million years accept false religion as being good for the promotion of civil society. I mean, that's one of the things that I was reading Anthony Burgess this morning, who was a Westminster divine and all that.
What were you reading?
Just sermons of his that I found on the internet.
Hey, send them to me, man. I'm always looking for everything that Burgess wrote. It's hard to find.
Yeah, well, to point to something kind of off topic here, one of the things I love Banner of Truth to death. I've benefited from everything I've ever done. And Reformation Heritage has done this too, but a new series of stuff is coming out by Anthony Burgess, by those publishing houses. And what they've done in the past, of course, is they've excised any of these political stuff from their writings, just focusing on soteriological and devotional type material. But I was reading Burgess this morning, and Burgess talks at length about the fact that one of the reasons why a magistrate should be concerned with circa sacra, with the church, is because God has given him that authority and that power and that desire to understand that killing a body is less important than the killing of a soul. And so and even the state has responsibility to make sure that the spiritual life of its inhabitants is being promoted for the good of the whole of society. Yeah, I don't even know if DeYoung would say that it's better for society for there to be multiple religions than for everyone to be a Christian. You know, that this idea that, you know, Christianity is almost one option among all the others, and it's wrong for the state to declare that Christianity is actually better for you spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, however you want to say that. But again, Burgess and these guys, and Gillespie the same way, you know, they understand the holistic nature of the human being to be just as much the concern of the state as the church.
Yeah. So a good example of that is the state does not have syringe medical power. It depends in this state with all the bureaucracies and stuff they kind of do. But, you know, the state is not there to give medicine and heal people. However, the state has an interest in its temporal power to use its coercion to regulate the medical realm. So if you have a hospital that is using medicine to kill people instead of fix them, it is in the interest of the state to use its temporal power of coercion to punitively restrain the medical realm or whatever from doing that, right? So it's the same thing. Like, well, you know, Jehovah's Witness, Roman Catholicism, it sends people to hell. It is bad for their souls, and it's also bad for their families and their holistic life. So it is good for us to regulate a outpost, to punitively restrain an outpost that is destroying people both temporally and eternally, because it is important in our realm, our jurisdiction, that lawyers use their authority appropriately, that pastors, that spiritual leaders use their. So we have no problems with us closing down CVS because they're trying to sell us aspirin that actually is cyanide. You can't do that. CVS is not supposed to sell aspirin as cyanide. But the thought that a Christian magistrate would go to the Kingdom Hall and say, you are not meeting here anymore because you are selling Christ and it is actually sending people to hell, people lose their minds.
Oh,
it's like we act like man physically, externally, is more valuable than he is comprehensively, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then we go into this weird spiel about, well, you know, faith does not come by coercion. This is not about bringing people to Christ. This is about restraining the unleashing of things that destroy people, right? Which would be conducive to the gospel, right? For example, when people realize that something is wrong and therefore it's wrong and it is restricted, it shows them the need for some kind of rescue, a necessity for intervention because the thing is wrong. So again, killing murderers does not save people, but the restraint and the law that convicts and indicts such behavior is conducive to people realizing that they need to be saved and converted from their murderous selves. So anyways, this is what I think is. Let me say this in public, and I'll probably be like get in trouble. But this is what is helpful about the Christian Nationalism book by Wolff, is he talks about the temporal not being eschatological, but being ordered unto the eschaton. We can order temporal life in a way that is conducive to the importance and primacy of the eschatological. But here's something interesting. I don't want to get stuck too long on some point, because I do want to have a lot of angles here. Listen to this quote. Until recently, this is DeYoung again, most Reformed Christians, especially in America, would have quickly dismissed the historic text as tragically mistaken and embraced the 1788 revision as obviously correct. In recent years, however, as Republican virtue has waned and as Democrat liberal consensus has broken down, some Christians have wondered anew if the magisterial reformers and the confessional documents from 16th and 17th centuries may have been right after all. So this is fascinating. I'm going to set it up for you and just go ahead and swing. After 1788, we all knew that the way and the truth and the life about political theology is principle pluralism, voluntarism. We all knew that. But something happened. And it is the last 5 years. And so because the Republican Party has spiraled downward and leftism is predominant, we're now, after hundreds of years of being convinced that voluntarism is the Bible, right? Now we're wondering, were those people in 1600s correct? And, I mean, that is problematic in many ways, but what are some ways that you see that as wrong, that statement? Well, we're really concerned about the cultural things, and so now we're looking for, the establishment principle.
Yeah. Part of the issue, again, goes back to making assumptions and projecting 2024 ideas onto the writers of the 1788, Westminster Confession. Witherspoon himself was very clear that religious liberty was only to apply to Christian denominations. I mean, even the Westminster Confession of Faith, as it's modified, there in 23, makes that clear. As it's laying things out, it says denominations. It's not referring to Muslim denominations. It's not referring to, Hindu denominations, right? The understanding still is that within the American situation, however you want to put that Christian culture, promoted by Christian magistrates, would encourage the whole of the culture to continue to be Christian. Ironically, Witherspoon was very much in favor of cultural Christianity. He felt like, that would hold everything together. I mean,
in his state, you couldn't even be elected to office if you weren't a Christian.
That's right. And one of the funny things about this too, of course, Witherspoon wrote an entire satirical essay against people who wanted to ban clergy from serving in civil office. Nowadays, people would stroke out if a Christian minister, ran for Congress or the Senate or president. Now, to be clear, that's only if he's a Republican, right? There's, a certain state, there's a certain senator from the state of Georgia right now who's a minister, who promotes abortion, who promotes homosexuality, who promotes all kinds of wickedness, but he's a minister. And so nobody seems to care about Christian nationalism when it comes to that. It's only one side of the ledger that can't be a Christian nationalist, evidently. Yeah, but again, this idea that there is almost Nestorian division between spirituality, Christianity, biblical religion, the Ten Commandments and the civil sphere would be just mind-boggling, even to deists in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the non-believing cultural affected Christians of a couple hundred years ago had a higher view of Christ in the civil sphere,
right,
than true Reformed pastors today. So yeah, you brought up some important things like 23:3. First of all, it says the magistrates are to protect the church of our common Lord. So it doesn't say that they're supposed to protect Islam or Buddhist, but the church of our common Lord. So you see this common language, which has Christendom language. And then it says, you brought this up, no law of any commonwealth should interfere with or hinder the due exercise thereof among voluntary members of any denomination of Christians. So it doesn't say that that states should not get in the way of other religions. It says you should not get in the way of different denominations. Now remember, what is the context? The context is a lot of these people have left England, where they were persecuted for, not being a part of the prelate faction, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what's in mind. Like, look, hey, when you come over here, we're not going to come after you if you're a different Christian. But it doesn't mean that you can't be harassed if you are some kind of other idolatrous worshiper. And it was interesting too. The citation of this is Psalms 105:15, the one about no law shall interfere. It says, he permitted no one to do them wrong. Yes, he rebuked kings for their sake, saying, do not touch my anointed ones and do my prophets no harm. This is a text about God being zealous over his people. This is not about God allowing the civil sphere to not interfere with idolaters. But then two people do mention something later. It says, which this came up also in the Chris Gordon Wilson conversation. It is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the person. This is in the same section, and good name of all their people, in such an effectual manner as that no person be suffered either upon pretense of religion or infidelity to offer any indignity, violence, or abuse or injury to any person whatsoever. So basically, like they say, there you go. There is the infidelity word is indicative of the fact that other religions can practice their idolatry publicly unhindered. But I mean, have you spoken to that point? I have a thought, but I'm curious that infidelity part, is that a point that they have to their point?
Well, I mean, it depends on how broadly you want to define the word infidelity, and how you want to parse out the nature of that. But I'd love to hear what you take from that.
Well, I mean, the same way when we do this with the text of Scripture, context matters, right? Context matters. So, what do we know? We know that the church is to be the state is to be a nursing father church,
right?
Of who is that? Of our common Lord. We know that they're not to interfere. They're not to interfere with denominations that are different, that are Christian, the church of our common Lord practicing their faith, right? That's the conversation. That's the context. So I don't believe that this is speaking about something entirely different. To me, it could be a few things. Number one, you can't walk around beating up and lynching Christians for their infidelity, right? So this person basically, this is saying you can't do it Geneva, okay? Right. Where so and so said something blasphemous, and now he can get beat up and strung up and jacked up. I think this is protecting society from a few things, from vigilante assaults for people that are practicing Christianity wrongly. Why do I say practicing Christianity wrongly? Because the entire conversation is about the magistrate's protection over different denominations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think it's protecting from vigilantism, and I also think it's protecting from a level of extremity where individuals can be disciplined by the state for their failure to practice Christianity as they ought. So I think whatever the conversation is, it is about how we deal with individuals. That's why it says person and good name, right? This is speaking about how we deal with people individually, right?
Right.
And magistrates are to protect individuals who are in the pretense acting wrong, in the pretense of religion or infidelity. So they shouldn't be beat up. They shouldn't be lynched. And furthermore, the level of heightened and extreme punitive consequences that would come from Christians practicing things differently, right? It needs to be protected by the middle civil matters. So I think however you nuance this,
mm-hmm.
it is restraining a lack of restraint when Christians act like infidels. There needs to be, the magistrates should protect. And by the way, you have to keep in mind, like they're thinking about the societies that they come from, where somebody doing something blasphemous, somebody doing something idolatrous, could lead to a riot, a fight, a bloodbath, right? So I think that's what's in mind. I'm being a bit verbose now, but I don't think the conversation is shifting to now a entire other faith of groups of people that have nothing to do with this conversation about protecting Christians now needs to be allowed to never be restricted in their worship. The reason why I also believe it's not possible for that to be the case is we'll get there later. The rest of the standards talk regularly about how false religion needs to be publicly restrained. So It's not like the Westminster holders of these views, all of a sudden, they made a statement about public blasphemy and false religion being protected here that they negated to address in a dozen other places, right? So the whole thinking of the standards about restraint when it comes to irreligion, particularly that is false religions, it must be taken into account when we think about this. So the whole conversation is a regulation of Christians. And the whole context is the violence that Christians often inflict on other Christians that they consider to be infidels, right? So the Scots, the Scottish Reformed looking at the Anglicans and being like, they serve Satan, we're gonna burn down. We're gonna burn down that place where they're offering this kind of like a Roman Catholic like service. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean and I mean to take it a little elsewhere. One of the things we talked about already again is the way that DeYoung and others take a lot of the conversation that's happening and extrapolate and say, well, of course it's moved to where it is now. There's just been this progressive change and progressive movement. Witherspoon may have been here and he may not have fully understand all of his principles, but he has, if he was alive today, he would agree with us and he would apply things the way we do. And yes, Witherspoon said blasphemy was wrong. And yes, he, approved a state constitution in New Jersey that required Protestants to be elected to office. And yes, he was in favor of this and this and this. But, again, this idea as Americans that we are continually moving forward. I found it always ironic that these guys are amillennial, but they have a very post-millennial view of doctrine and of history when it comes to the civil magistrate.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That, they don't think the church advances, but they certainly think the doctrine of the magistrate has advanced past the childish stage.
Yeah. It's progressing. It's getting better and better and better. The doctrine of the magistrate is getting better, but the expanse and influence of the kingdom is not getting better. But yeah, just to close that loop, a magistrate should protect those acting in infidelity and pretense, even Christians. They should protect them, meaning like they deserve a trial. They deserve a trial, and they deserve a trial with biblical evidence presented. So they should be protected. Violence and mob violence and injury to people because of infidelity should be something that the magistrate protects and uses justice to inquire as to what is going on. But here's another thing that is important to consider is when DeYoung says this. The Westminster Divines thought about the relationship between church and state in the way most Reformed Christians did at the time. Close quote. Another quote. Given the broad consensus about the magistrate's role, it's little wonder that when the Westminster Assembly met on September 10th, 1644, to investigate the sins that could be provoking God's wrath in the current conflict with the king. So basically, I feel like we're developing a common theme now. It's revisionism and this elitism about us and them. But here's it is. So look, the reason why we need to change our view of civil things is because these men who wrote our standards, they were products of their time. I had a church member today that is struggling with some of the things going on here, basically say, yeah, you guys teach us stuff from the Westminster Standards about the civil sphere, but those guys were like in the time of medieval and kings, and so they're products of their time. Like, do you think that's fair to say that the political theology of Rutherford was merely the environmental reflexes of political theology? Now, I'm pretty sure what the answer is, but go ahead, bro. Is that what they did? Did Rutherford just look around and say, "Well, this is what it is. I don't even know what I'm doing. It's like the frog in the hot water."
Right.
Like, is that what's happening?
I mean, I was having this conversation, a related conversation with somebody the other day. Yeah, and it always amazes me when I go back and read these guys how conversant they are with the church fathers. I mean, they're just constantly quoting from Jerome and from Bernard and from Anselm and from Constantine and from Augustine and from this Cappadocian and that Cappadocian, and they're super wet. See, that's the other thing. These guys are so much better educated than we are. Yeah, I mean, it's not even close.
I mean, they're going to college when they're like 14 years old.
There's no way in God's grace I could pass a Presbyterian exam from like 100 years ago, let alone 300 years ago. I mean, I can barely speak English, let alone Greek, Hebrew, and Latin.
Well, in the early church, you had to have the Psalter memorized to get ordained.
I know, and so there's again this kind of snobbery. Yeah, you look back, and I mean, there is so much of Rutherford that is written in Latin that remains untranslated. His systematic theology was written completely in Latin.
I didn't even know he wrote one, man.
I mean, RHB is supposed to be coming out with, a new set of totally unpublished works in English by Rutherford. It was supposed to come out this spring, but I haven't heard anything new about it in a while. And maybe they're discovering things that they don't want to come out. And so they're trying to figure out how to handle that. But, the idea that Samuel Rutherford, who wrote the seminal volume on political theology, Lex Rex, was just repeating what he heard his professors say, or was just unthinking, uncritical of the situation is just, it's unreal to think that. But I mean, that's effectively what's being said, is these guys just couldn't see past their own nose.
Well, the issue with that is that what the environment around them was three views that were the voluntarism was a view. By the way, Gibson has I believe it's Gibson. He has a really interesting work where he shows that we may get to that later. I don't know. That the reason why the church, why Romanism as an ecclesiocracy, whatever, was because the church had a voluntarist posture. And so voluntarism is around, particularly you have with all the heretics. By the way,
the Brownists.
All the heretics were voluntarists. You have Erastians. That's very much in the water, right? The state over the church, and then you have Romanism, the church over the state. This is the majority of what's around them. And what I believe that the Westminster theology forge is something that is not merely expressive of the political climate. They combat Erastianism, and they say the state is not over the church. Now, even it's funny, Doug Wilson thinks that Doug Wilson in his debate with Chris Gordon says that the original Westminster Standards were somewhat Erastian. 23.3 originally is very much not Erastian. Now, you have no authority over the keys is not Erastian, but people think because they can exercise external authority over first table matters that is putting their hand on the keys. But no, they're codifying. Bannerman actually talks about this. How can this be Erastian when the very language in 23 is controversial and counter? It's antithetical to Erastian. So it's not Erastian, which is and it's not Roman, where the church has this authority. This Revelation 17 authority over the state. They very much exegeted a political theology, which in many ways, I believe, was distinct. It was not a product of the times. It was something, I believe, not new, but a development in a codification of political theology that was a contrast. And by the way, the Westminster Standards in many ways are a contrast. The Sabbath is something that is a bit distinct in the Westminster tradition. The RPW is a bit distinct in the Westminster tradition, right? This is not an expression of general things. A lot of what is said there is giving a unique angle. It's not fair to say that about them at all. And that's why they wrote so much. I mean, Lex Rex is, Lex Rex is just an articulation of the Christendom political thinking of the day. No way, he got killed for that, bro. I'm sorry, he didn't get killed for that. He was gonna be executed for it, and he died.
That's right. He was. It's like the most Scottish thing about Rutherford, right? He rather would have died in his bed than be executed by the state.
But he's just writing what everyone already
is that some of the criticism every now and then I hear about establishmentarianism, especially as Westminster understands it, is that as you kind of know, there's this idea that these guys couldn't have understood the world without it, and also that they didn't understand the dangers of it. Well, if anybody on God's green earth understood the dangers of the state bearing the sword, it was the Covenanters.
Absolutely.
And it most assuredly was Rutherford. So if he felt like biblical principle was at stake, that this was not, the establishment was not, well, what's the best thing that's going to work in England, Scotland, and Wales? Then maybe you could criticize them for that. But again, all of this stuff is built out of and is grounded on biblical exegesis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, Yeah, and we kind of joke about this every now and then, but there's a real Marcionistic stream in the way that the criticism against establishment come. How often do you hear people say, all right, well, that's the Old Testament, or that's theocratic Israel, or that's look how well it worked for Israel, that kind of stuff. But that's not how we do exegesis for anything else. If you're going to apply that to infant baptism, and you were told, well, that's Old Testament. We can't make these corollaries between circumcision and water baptism. Well, that's Old Testament. That's Jewish, or whatever you want to phrase. Well, of course, we would fail a guy in an exam if he refused to use the Old Testament to defend infant baptism. So the idea, again, that the rules around the civil magistrate and the conversation are different than any other part of theology is just bizarre, if not something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. All right, next quote that I think is relevant to this conversation is he makes a huge deal out of nursing father being the part of the language in the 1788-23 section. So here's what he says, the nursing father thing. In its place, the American revision lists 4 basic functions for the civil magistrate relative to the church. Protect the church so its ministry and assemblies aren't disturbed. By the way, interestingly, when Chris Gordon was asked by I think it was Longshore or Wilson, they're like, okay, the Westminster 23, the modern standards, we protect the church. Do we protect Buddhism? And he said, yeah. So I'm like, really, is that what those guys that wrote that were thinking? Nursing father to the church, and that implies to have that nursing father role to someone who's not your kid. Anyway, I think really cool. To protect the church's ministry and the assemblies aren't disturbed, give no preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest, ensure no law infringes on the free exercise and free association of Christians, and protect all people so no one is injured or maligned based on his or her religion or lack of religion. The civil magistrate in the American revision is still accountable to God. Okay, he consents that. But now he's a nursing father who provides parental protection for the church to flourish rather than a guardian and avenger of both tables of the law. The phrase nursing father was a common designation for kings, other magistrates going back centuries in Protestant political thought. The label that would encompass many different functions, but the general idea was that the magistrate would have a supportive role to play relative to true religion. Moreover, the establishment principle has been removed in favor of the voluntary principle of church membership. So basically, nursing father is basically when DeYoung reads nursing father, what he actually read was nursing mother, because the nursing father just encourages and supports, but doesn't have first table, doesn't have avenger guardianship of the both tables of the law. So the nursing father, which functionally is a nursing mother, is just, hey, church, I'm here for you. But as a nursing father, which is more mother-like in the unpacking of it, you don't avenge both tables. Now, I wrote an article. We'll see if it comes out. I think it's going to come out. I have 4 parts because I wrote like 40 pages. But have you thought about the nursing father theological meaning? Like when a Reformed Presbyterian cites Isaiah 49:23, like what are they saying? Are they saying first table enforcement is canceled by nursing father language. Is that what they would have thought?
Well, I mean, yeah, Matthew Poole, the Reformed commentator on Scripture, I know off the top of my head that he believed that that passage was partly fulfilled by folks like Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes and, the pagan kings who nursed Israel and protected Israel and provided for Israel, even giving Israel the means by which to rebuild the temple and their homeland after the exile. And so you take that application, if that is true of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, what would make you think that that wouldn't apply then to the civil magistrate in 2024 or whenever? That this idea of nursing father is one, again, who provides, not just care, but nourishment for the individual. Now, as Christians, we understand that where does our nourishment come from? Right? Our nourishment doesn't come from the state making sure that corn gets grown in Iowa. Right? Nourishment comes by the word of the living God. Right? That's what nourishment means for the believer. So if a state is going to be a nursing father to the church, then it just seems to make sense to me, just on basic terms, that means that the state is going to ensure that I'm able to receive the nourishments of the word and the sacraments, for that matter, in my local church, and that I'm not going to have to worry about poison being poured into me, to use your CVS example. that this idea of nursing is very much one that is directed by the word of God. I mean, it's even kind of repeated in some ways in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22, right? That the rulers are to submit themselves and governments to Christ because he's the head over all things for the church. Right? So the rulers who are head over all things for the church are nursing fathers, right? They are to protect and encourage and strengthen the body of Christ so that we can go out and do the work that God called us. We can fulfill the Great Commission and all that kind of stuff. There's no sense in the Bible, at least the Bible I read, that there's more than two choices. The state is either going to be a nursing father or it's going to be a tool of the evil one. It's not a neutral entity.
So you don't. I'm being like devil's advocate here. So you don't believe in common grace?
That's right. Yeah, I deny common grace. In effect, I mean, nursing father is the fulfillment of common grace. Right? That's the idea that the state is to be kind of to use more of that nursery term. That the state is kind of almost like the daycare center for the church, right? It's watching over us until Jesus comes and picks us up, right? That's kind of the way I think Isaiah 49:23 is meant to be understood.
Well, I think that's what's also embedded in Genesis with the implementation of the judicial sword, which I believe is to be civilly understood is okay. The whole thing that happened with the church before, the covenant of grace now is going to be accompanied with a temporal sphere that has judicial power to execute and threaten. And so the church needs a magistrate with a true sword that enforces it in order for the world to be the daycare, so to speak, ideal for her ministry. But here's what's interesting. Let me read to you the original 23:3. He hath authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinance of God be truly duly settled, administered, and observed. Do you know what the citation for the original 23:3 is?
Why don't you enlighten us?
Isaiah 49:23.
Shock of all shocks.
So here's what I found fascinating. The 1788 Presbyterians, they had this entire different vision, a antithetical vision by which you got to pick this one or the other one. This is totally different. Why? Because they decided to go with Isaiah 49:23 language of nursing father. So they wanted to draw this radical, antithetical discontinuity by using the same proof text for the same section. Now, I find that not a very good way to make an emphatical statement that we're trying to go down two entirely different paths. We're using the same proof text about the magistrate, right? So that's a problem for me. But what's good about us is that we don't have to just sit here and say, hey, DeYoung, hey, Benjamin, what do you think nursing father means? You know, we can just, we have like Amazon and the internet. We can just look, what did people mean when they use this term as Reformed people? Okay. And, I found a couple. Calvin says this about Isaiah 49:23. This took place when the Lord revealed himself to the whole world by the gospel, for mighty kings and princes not only submitted to the yoke of Christ, but likewise contributed their riches to raise up and maintain the church of Christ, so as to be her guardians and defenders. Nothing is said here about enriching the houses of those who under false pretense hold themselves out to be ministers of the church, which is nothing else than to corrupt the church of God and destroy it by deadly poison, but about removing superstitions and putting an end to all wicked idolatry, about advancing the kingdom of Christ and maintaining purity in doctrine, about purging scandals and cleansing from the filth that corrupts piety and impairs the luster of the divine magistrate. So there you have a Calvinistic, by Calvin himself, explanation of the idea of nursing father in Isaiah 49:23. Wiley, Samuel Wiley, he's an American Presbyterian, right? Listen to what he says about this. To be a nursing father implies protection. We are informed in the 9th chapter of 2 Kings that Jehu was anointed to cut off the idolatrous house of Ahab. In the 10th chapter, we are told, verse 25, that he destroyed the worshipers of Baal. And in the 30th verse, God commends him for doing so. And he took away the Sodomites out of the land and removed all the idols that his father had made. And also Maacah, his mother, even her, he removed her from being queen because she had made an idol in a grovel, and Ada destroyed her idol and burnt it by the brook Kidron. And in this we're told he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father. So we have, now I picked two, but I could do this for a while. When Reformed men speak of nursing father, they are speaking about Christendom and a magistrate that indeed is an enforcer of both tables of the law, that prioritizes the church and also intimidates competition. Like that's the idea that nursing father could imply all that DeYoung is saying is very insensitive to the very proof text that is used for the original standards, and also for the way that this term in this text is used. If you want to make a case for R2K principled pluralism, you don't open up Isaiah 49:23. I mean, you just don't. It's almost like It's almost like I want to make a case for a secular magistrate, and I'm going to cite Psalms 2:10-12. Like, you don't do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just you can probably go like, my kingdom is out of this world. But Isaiah 49:23 is very much an establishmentarian like text. That's how it's used, right? But we had this conversation before. But I do think because it's around the corner again, it's helpful to have it again, not as extensively, but somewhat. So DeYoung, he looks at 23:3. He sees the changes. And he says, literally, what was his quote? He says, let me read it again. Let me see if I can find it. Moreover, the establishment principle has been removed. So 23.3, because of nursing father and other things, the establishment principle has been removed in favor of the voluntary principle of church membership. So 23.3 kills establishmentarianism and enshrines voluntarism. Now, Benjamin, is the current American standards promoting the establishment principle in other places? The answer is yes, but why don't you help us see where? Where is DeYoung's home run about 23.3 countered by excessively other places articulating this establishment principle that is not voluntarism? Where would you go to show people that?
Well, I mean, as they're revising the confession, he makes much of Westminster Confession of Westminster Larger Catechism, I should say, 109. The removal of the little clause there. But if you go all the way down in the Larger Catechism to where you have the prayer for the second petition in 191, the testimony there, seems to either have been missed by the revisers. So either the argument is they're incompetent and they didn't check all their sources, or there was still interest in, I'm going to reference something else here in a second, but in, kind of a soft establishmentarianism. The idea, again, that while we're not going to give preference to denominations, we are going to give preference to the Christian faith. Question 191, and I'm reading from the Orthodox Presbyterian Church Larger Catechism. 191, the second petition, which is thy kingdom come, acknowledging ourselves and all mankind to be by nature under the dominion of sin and Satan. We pray that the kingdom of sin and Satan may be destroyed, the gospel propagated throughout the world, the Jews called, the fullness of Gentiles brought in, the church furnished with all gospel officers and ordinances, purged from corruption, countenanced and maintained by the civil magistrate, that the ordinance of Christ may be purely dispensed and made effectual the converging of those that are yet in their sins, and the confirming, comforting, and building up of those already converted, that Christ would rule in our hearts here and hasten the time of his second coming, and are reigning with him forever, and that he would be pleased so to exercise the kingdom of his power in all the world as may be best conduced to these ends. So question 191 continues to have this testimony that the civil magistrate is to countenance and maintain the church insofar as it is furnished with gospel officers and ordinances.
Which
so is curious that they would not change that.
So basically, let's what you said before you started that was helpful. So either these guys didn't really know their standards, and they just noticed something that they missed in other places, or alternative B, they knew what you just said. They felt no need to change what you just said because they weren't trying to make an antithetical confession about the magistrate, right? I mean, that one you cited, like I actually in my book on the magistrate, it's not out yet, but it's on the way. It says something really interesting. It says, let me find it. And I know you explain it pretty well, but notice something. It says that the church is furnished with all gospel offices and ordinances, purged from corruption, counted and maintained by the civil magistrate, that the ordinance of Christ may be purely dispensed. Like, that's one thing I want to add. It's saying that the magistrate being about the ministry of the church, being countenance, is that their ordinances be purely dispensed. Now, that could scare the death out of somebody in America right now. The purity of the ordinances administered has a connection with the countenancing and maintaining. It's not just let's make sure that the magistrate countenance this ministry, but he countenances that the ordinances be remain pure. And then I say that, and all of a sudden, like the young theologian lose their mind and saying, "Whoa, this is the gospel being dependent upon the state." And okay, no, that's not that. The church needing families does not make the church dependent upon families in some disproportionate gospel-like sense, right? The church needing men and fathers, right? The church needing magistrates to be deacons and do their job, and that being a part of how they do their job. God works through creation in his spiritual means, right? But yeah, that's a very establishmentarian text. And by the way, it's a very post-millennial text. It's a very historicism text,
right?
And it's still there. And then there's other places you can go, like, right, you can go to the conversation in the Catechism about the Sabbath, right? 118. It says that superiors are to be about the Sabbath, and it says they're supposed to, in being about the Sabbath, be punitive about the Sabbath, because the citation of 118 in our current standards, it cites Nehemiah beating people up for Sabbath breaking, right? So those standards still have a magistrate that is being an enforcer of the first table of the law, right? DeYoung talks about 108 being changed, but he doesn't talk about 109, right? 109, I'm sorry. He talks about 109 being changed, but not 108.
Right.
108 says that we are to disapprove, detest, and oppose all false worship according to each one's place in calling, removing it and all monuments of idolatry. The citation for that is the Old Testament kings removing monuments of idolatry in their temporal civil sphere, right? So everybody in their place, including magistrates, should be about first table concerns in their place. That's in our current standards, right? 21.5 says the moral law. What's the moral law, Pastor? Is it 5 to 10 or 1 to 10?
Well, again, my catechism says the whole of the commandments, that all 10 of them, I'm pretty sure is what my catechism says.
Yeah, it's all 10. The moral law binds who? The moral law, which is all 10, it binds who? All, as well as justified persons, as others, to the obedience thereof. So the moral law binds everybody to both tables. That's still in our standards, right? What's interesting in Westminster Confession 23.2, the citation for Christians to accept the office of magistrate is Psalms 2:10 and 12. So that Psalms 2:10 and 12, which is that Reformed text to speak about the need for people in the magisterial realm to confess Christ in their realms, particularly, that is cited as the proof text for the magistrate in 23.2.
Right.
22.6 on biblical oaths cites Isaiah 19:21, which is that choice covenanter text about national covenanting. Westminster 21.8 cites Nehemiah 13 about the Sabbath. You also have question 129 in the Larger Catechism on the fifth commandment. It says that superiors are required to provide all things necessary for soul and body. So in our standards, superiors, which would include civil magistrates, they are to, in their power, provide all things necessary for soul and body. So I could do this much longer, and I did a whole podcast on it. If any of you want to hear it, me and Ben did it. We did much more citations, but just the point is, DeYoung's point that 23.3 being changed is overstating the case, because the principle of establishment
Mm-hmm.
is in a multiplicity of places. Like the same thing, like you can change. Gavin Beers brought this up in the podcast I did with him on Antichrist. You could change 25 about the Pope is that Antichrist, but the principle of the Pope as that Antichrist is embedded in so many conversations.
Right.
You know, so it's not a slam dunk home run when you find this language change here. But what's interesting is, let me read this quote. Moving on. The fact that 1788 version of 23.3 was almost a complete revision of the 1646 text is well known, or it should be. What's less well known and has been much less explored is why the Presbyterians gathering in Philadelphia in 1788 considered, without any controversy, the original version so strikingly untenable, an amended version of their beloved confession with such a marked improvement. What happened? So, interestingly, he says in 1788, these changes happened very easily, very simply. And then he says, what happened before 1788 that led to this radical change being so well accepted? And there's this whole section in the article about how we get to 1788 being such an easy done thing. But I got a question, Benjamin. Can you tell me what were the exegetical textual reasons that the assembly brought forth in 1788 about the civil magistrate needing to be adjusted? Do you know where that is?
I cannot locate it at present.
Do you know why you can't locate it?
Why is that?
Because it doesn't exist.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't. Imagine like this monumental change, changing our views of the confession and how we read the scriptures, and we have no minutes that no one on this Presbyterian planet can produce. So we don't have that. So it could be multiple reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing he says is the Adopting Act. Do you remember the conversation where he says the Adopting Act is this radical movement into that shifting?
Right.
Right. So he says colonial Presbyterians had already broken with the Westminster forefathers in the matter of the church-state relations by the time of the Adopting Act in 1729, when the ministers of the Synod of Philadelphia adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger and shorter catechisms. And then he says, he quotes something they say in a declaration. The Synod unanimously declared that they do not receive those articles in any sense to suppose the civil magistrate had the controlling power over synods and respect to the exercise of their ministerial authority or power to persecute for any religion, or in any sense contrary to the Protestant succession of the throne of Great Britain. So the Adopting Act makes a statement about the magistrate not having this kind of authority that would have been comparable to Britain. Do you have any thoughts about the Adopting Act and why that statement was made and what it implied?
Well, one of the issues with the Adopting Act that has stayed with the mainline church, if I can put it that way, because DeYoung has cleaned up his language a little bit. He recognizes that the seceders and covenanters did have nothing to do with the Adopting Act, and of course,
but you guys don't matter because you're not.
We're small, so we don't matter.
Yeah, you don't matter.
They and of course, part of the reason for that is because in 1729, Ebenezer Erskine is still a member of the Church of Scotland. The secession hasn't even happened yet, so obviously that doesn't affect us at all. But one of the things about the seceders is when they come to America, the colonies in the 1740s and 50s, is they discover that the Adopting Act has allowed all kinds of questionable theological positions to be held within the Presbyterian Church in the colonies. Golightly, one of the ministers, writes back to the secession church, complaining about the looseness of the Presbyterian ministers in the colonies. And so again, the Adopting Act is not like this some magical thing that fixes all the problems. It seems to just create more, because it looses subscription to the confession on a number of issues, not just this narrow question about civil magistrate, but even, if we were to take the Adopting Act as this, again, monumental chain, the idea again is that, whether or not you subscribe to the Confession of Faith as it was given in 1647, one of the things that I kind of joked with somebody about DeYoung's characterization of things is it really shouldn't be Philadelphia and London, because nobody in London ever subscribed to the Confession of Faith. It was adopted in Edinburgh by the Church of Scotland. So it really should be Philadelphia and Edinburgh, if he wants to put it that way. But again, the question here has to do, again, with how it is we're going to understand not just the Establishment Clause in relation to the Adopting Act, but all kinds of other things. There was a fella in New England by the name of Jonathan Dickinson, who was denying the sufficiency of the Bible in the matters of faith and life. And as he's doing this, he's citing, again, this idea that he refuses to bow the knee to the confession. And so the Adopting Act really is about trying to figure a way to get all these different streams of Presbyterianism in the colonies into one group. And so it's actually a point that I wouldn't necessarily want to promote this idea that, well, here we go. In 1729, they adopted this thing and they clarified it. It was already there. Well, there's a lot of problems going on in the Presbyterian Church in the colonies. And, maybe you shouldn't kind of establish, no pun intended, your whole argument on something that is less helpful than it could have been.
Yeah. Well, he does more than that. He does bring up Pufendorf and Locke. And he says that, a lot of Reform people started being affected by, I don't even know why that's a good thing. But he brings it up as like, I guess the thinking of these Enlightenment guys, I guess, help shape the thinking of the church on things. And actually, interesting, in that part, he makes it sound like these Enlightenment thinkers were the ones that were more strategically appropriate for the church to be protected in places like France. So basically, the voluntarist, secular thinkers of the day, they're the ones that were saying leave the church alone. I don't know. That I'm not even really going to go there, but you could please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Your points are really good and helpful, but in the Adopting Act and in these statements that the Young declarations that are stated here, the Westminster standards are not changed, correct? Nothing is changed in the standards.
Certainly not officially.
Yeah.
But,
so,
with the Adopting Act, I mean, they allow all kinds of exceptions and, the confession. So, I mean, like you said, you already referenced Dickinson. I mean, he takes an exception to plenary inspiration.
Yeah.
We would certainly not allow that today.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of questions around essential and necessary articles and things. In the Adopting Act.
In the Adopting Act, they say the Westminster Standards are our confession of faith. And then they have these concessions and statements about certain theological issues. But that is not the changing of the Westminster Standard. That's important to bring out, because just because six-day creation is an exception, just because we have we have ridiculous exceptions in the PCA. You can take exceptions to the one about marrying Catholics. You could take exceptions to Sunday being the Lord's Day. You can take exceptions to the second commandment. You could take exceptions to the Sabbath. That doesn't mean that we have changed the standard. That's what I'm saying. Like, just because in the Adopting Act, there is declarations that allow for exceptions on this or that or the other, that does not mean that they're changed. That's an important thing to bring out. Like, the Westminster Standard change when 3/4 of the body vote for that change. And so we see changes in the Westminster Standards actually happen in 1788. Right. But in the Adopting Act, like you said, that wasn't changing the confession. That was loosey-goosey accommodation for weird Presbyterians. Mm-hmm. They were trying to get together with all. I mean, their sociology was messed up. I mean, that's again, like, that's a bad point to plant your foot and say, here goes the exegetical evolution in a good way.
Right.
But here's the thing, like, we brought this up earlier, and I want to, like, just say a little bit more about that. We're kind of, coming towards the end. It is helpful to think, okay, so in 1788, Presbyterians said 23:3 needs to be changed. And you said your knee-jerk reaction was, what about this theologian, that theologian? What about this guy, that guy? Because when you hear American theologians talk after 1788, they're not making a case for voluntarism. They're not making a case for a non-first table. Now, obviously, I wouldn't say nobody is. But, I mean, just think about this. So, in 1788, according to DeYoung's take, we became voluntarists. We became first table is no longer the magisterial role of enforcement. Well, how about PCA GA 1815? Okay. This is, what? How many years later? I'm not good at math.
35.
Like, 35 years later. Okay, listen to what the voluntarists, because in 1788, boom, 23:3, voluntarism enshrined. Look at what the Presbyterians say. A free government, therefore, in which existing laws have lost their efficacy, presents to view a government in which the supreme authority lies prostrate under the feet of lawless and disobedient. In producing the most unhappy state of society, the first efforts of iniquity will be exerted to silence those laws and regulations which most powerfully counteract the depraved feelings of the heart, which tend to strengthen the moral sense, and which remind men of their accountability to that tribunal from which there is no appeal. If, therefore, the main spring of moral instruction and moral thing is found in the due sanctification of the Sabbath, to destroy its influence to them so irksome will be the first efforts of the sons of Belial. So this is what the Presbyterians, who decided to be voluntarists and nursing father affirmers of the non-first table enforcing magistrate, this is what they said to the government afterwards, that very much express that, right? Do you get that sentiment that these men were voluntarists that didn't care about our government being one who enforces the particularities of our religion and our Sabbath? Is that what you get? I don't get that from that, right?
Well, no, I mean, yeah. If I stood, well, I'm not in the PCA, but if I was in the PCA and I stood up and read that paragraph on the floor, I mean, people would have a moo cow. I mean, because that's all kinds of intertwining church and state. That's all kinds of speaking prophetically to the civil magistrate, which we're told is in violation of the American revisions. The idea you would say something like that is smacking of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. But this is what 17 post. So according to DeYoung, like in 1788, we all knew that this old way of being about Christ's magisterial. We knew that it was done, but afterwards we have men still speaking with much of the theological sentiments of Christendom. I mean, just even Hodge. People quote Hodge a lot. Listen to Hodge. We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred right of human nature, as utterly inconsistent with the law of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ. So he's saying that this thing in civil society is irreconcilable with the gospel of Christ. So he's making connections with his theological categories and society. Let me continue. It is manifestly the duty of all Christians who enjoy the light of the present day, when the inconsistency of slavery, both with the dictates of humanity and religion, has been demonstrated and is generally seen and acknowledged, to use their honest, earnest, and unwearied endeavors to correct the errors of former times, and as speedily as possible to efface this blot on our holy religion, and to obtain the complete abolition of slavery throughout Christendom.
Yeah, I mean that seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah. He's thinking about the civil sphere in a way that needs to be enforcing realities and principles consistent with the gospel sphere, right?
Right.
Thornwell. Listen to Thornwell. He's a Southern Presbyterian. He's a spirituality church guy. He's a post 1788 guy. He's also a very influential representational theologian. He's not just some like anomaly, right? This is some of the stuff that he says. As the individual incumbent of God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently search him. So the state must be impressed with a profound sense of his all-pervading providence and of its responsibility to him. I'll read a few more. A state, therefore, which does not recognize its dependence on God, or which fails to apprehend in its functions and offices a commission from heaven, is false to the law of its own being. The sanctions of a secularized state, in fact, are insufficient either for the punishment of vice or the encouragement of virtue, unless they connect themselves with the higher sanction which religion discloses. It is not necessary that the state should have a religion. It is equally necessary, in order to an adequate fulfillment of its own ideas, that it have the true religion. It is not only necessary. Truth is the only proper food of the soul, and through superstition and error, though superstition and error may prevail for a time as external restraints, they never generate an inward principle of obedience. I'll read a few more. It's just, I don't know. I feel like people just need to hear this on the podcast. It is obvious that a commonwealth can no more be organized which shall recognize all religions than one which shall recognize none. I'll read another one. The service of the commonwealth becomes a very act of piety to God. The state realizes its religious character through the religious character of its subjects, and the state is and ought to be Christian, because all its subjects are and ought to be determined by the principles of the gospel. I'll read two more. Every legislator is bound to be a Christian man, he has no right to vote for any laws which are inconsistent with the teachings of the scriptures. He must carry his Christian conscience into the halls of legislation. One more. The separation of church and state is a very different thing from the separation of religion and state. Here is where our fathers erred. In their anxiety to guard against the evils of a religious establishment and to preserve the province of church and state separate and distinct, they virtually expelled Jehovah from the government of the country and left the state an irresponsible corporation, or responsible only to immediate corporators. They made it a moral person and yet not accountable to the source of all law.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't understand how you reconcile that with a view of not just principle pluralism, but of this idea that things radically changed after 1788. Probably, you referenced Thornwell, probably the best example of this lack of functional change was Thornwell's comments on the newly written Confederate Constitution. Outside of what you think about the Confederacy or whatever, this is proof positive, at least of Thornwell's position. Thornwell in December of 1861, after, they had met and wrote the new Constitution for the Confederate States, he wrote kind of a critique of this new Constitution. He says that in this letter, he says the changes which your honorable body has made in the Constitution of the United States, and which have been ratified and confirmed by the various states of the Confederacy, have received the near universal approval of the Presbyterian population of these states. And he congratulates them on their success and says, but gentlemen, we are constrained in candor to say that in our humble judgment, the Constitution, admirable as it is in other respects, still labors under one capital defect. It is not distinctively Christian. And he asks for their entreaty. He prays that the Constitution may be amended so as to express precise relations which the government of these states ought to sustain to the religion of Jesus Christ. And he goes on to speak at length at how the Confederate Constitution fails to recognize Jesus as the highest authority in the land. And so this is a Southern Presbyterian writing 80 years after the PCUSA assembly met and changed 23.3, 140 years after the Adopting Act, who is promoting the establishment of the Christian religion in again, whatever you think about this, they saw themselves in this way, a sovereign nation in the tradition of Washington, Jefferson, and everyone else. So again, this idea that they are continuing on these things, it is just, it's not in keeping with the historical record.
Yeah. So simply put, DeYoung and everybody who was very excited about this article, like, I think, what did Chris Gordon say? Oh, it was great. It was fantastic. The idea that the changes, which me and Benjamin acknowledge, it's, Christendom is softened. The establishment principle is undermined some, but the idea that there is a decisive, radical, disjunctive transition from the establishment principle to voluntarism is absolutely and totally inconsistent with how Presbyterians spoke about the magistrate post 1788. To be honest, most of what these guys are making a case for is post 1960. Not that there wouldn't be some of this more in the 1900s. Here's an interesting quote, just to your point. Listen to this. I got so many quotes here, I'm getting lost. So this is another GA in the Southern Church, Presbyterian Church. We are accustomed to consider that our prosperity as a nation depends on the smiles of heaven, and that the profanation of the Sabbath is calculated to awaken the displeasure of God and to bring down his judgment. Our nation needs to be receiving the smiles of heaven. Bro, these guys, let me tell you something. Even the American Presbyterian, people talk about, like, you guys want to quote Rutherford and Gillespie and Owen. If the American Presbyterians into the late 1800s were talking right now, like, these guys would be just going off on them as well, So that is not so that the Americans post 1788 become these voluntarists. But here's one more point before we land the plane. This is interesting. DeYoung says this. He believes, he's talking about Witherspoon, civil liberty and religious liberty always went hand in hand. Lose one and you lose the other. As he said in The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, his famous sermon from May 1776 that paved the way for independence. So he's quoting Witherspoon here. Listen to the quote. I do not wish to oppose anybody's religion but everybody's wickedness. I do not wish to oppose anybody's religion, but everybody's wickedness. What do you think about that statement? I mean, I know it's Witherspoon's, but DeYoung is citing it as he's making a case for his political theology, which is he's inserting into the standards. I don't wish to oppose any religions, but everyone's wickedness. What do you think? Is that a Presbyterian?
Well, again, how are you defining what wickedness is? Is there some amorphous idea of natural law that is outside the moral law that God has given to us in the scriptures? I don't understand how you can define wickedness in such a way, or really anything of that nature, without turning yourself once back to the living and true God.
Well, I mean, that's one way to think about it, but it is the first table wicked when you break it? I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
Like, what is it like? Like our catechism says, sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. Is the first four include that? Larger Catechism 152 says every sin deserves God's wrath and curse. 99.5 says what God forbids is at no time to be done. So wickedness is breaking the first commandment, the second commandment, the third commandment, the fourth commandment, the fifth commandment. I mean, I don't understand how a Presbyterian would cite that statement as being something that would be consistent. And this is what the thing, hey, I didn't say this earlier, but one of the things I'm noticing is for you to change 23, I'm sorry, not change 23, because I don't think the changes are that exaggerated. But if you believe that 23.3 calls for this view of society and the magistrate, you're not just changing 23.3 in your view, you're changing our view of the law of God. You're changing our view on covenant theology, on how representational figures have a responsibility to their collective groups. You're also changing Christology, because a lot of the
right.
This is what I don't like about a lot of the Christian nationalism conversations in our present day, is they lack the Christological grounding of that conversation previously. Our understanding of Christ informs the way we understand society and the political sphere, which is why you read the catechism and you see Christ's kingship over church and state. So your Christology needs to change. Your view of the law of God needs to change. It's not just, you know what, let me just slice up some things in my head in the civil sphere, right? Would you agree that there's a Christological, there's a law of God comprehensive connectedness to how you process this conversation? It's not just this isolated thing that you could just pull out and then not unhinge something significant.
Right. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, to go back to something you said a real second is, or earlier, one of the things I really dislike about the Christian nationalism conversation is that there seems to be about 14 different streams that all are talking at the same time. And DeYoung and others want to lump everybody into one group. And also, they want to use individuals and statements and other things to try to discredit anyone who's speaking about this. Use scare words, use scare people, use scare ideas. And they refuse to actually interact with any of the actual arguments being made. So you get articles like this one that we've been talking about that, that DeYoung and others want to act like some slam dunk case against Christian nationalism, when, it doesn't take 5 minutes for you to find all these quotes that seem to disagree with DeYoung's own application of Witherspoon and the 1788 revisions. And And this is a larger thing going on in the reform world right now. Part of the problem that the gatekeepers have is that you and I and others can get on our Google machine and we have access to
people,
thousands of resources. And
we have access to people that will listen.
Yeah, and that too. I mean, that's something that's going on in American culture kind of writ large. You don't have the 3 networks and PBS anymore.
Yeah.
Right? And you don't even have the cable channels anymore. It's the Wild West in some ways when it comes to communication. And so the same kind of gatekeeping that you see, ironically, in American politics is happening in the American church. Appeals to authority and all those kind of things to try to just quiet people down. When most of us are just trying to go back to the sources, right? We're just trying to be faithful to what we believe the scriptures to teach, as well as what we find all over the Reformed tradition prior to 1960.
Yeah, and that's the issue. I think with a lot. I mean, in this conversation, I'm not saying this is like DeYoung per se, but I mean, he's just in that strain of. I think what some of this is about is there's been people that have been known for reform theology and being reform promoters, and they've been gatekeepers, they've been mouthpieces, they've been pillars, and something's happened in the last 10 years, particularly the last 5 years, where there is an awakening of historic retrieval. And it's not just that it's there in more ways, but people are reading it. You know what I'm saying? Like, even like, Zachary Garrett's book gets published, by New Christendom Press. And there's like hundreds and hundreds of quotes of reformers in that book. So like, there's a viral explosion of content that is historic.
Right.
And people are reading it and they're doing podcasts about it. They're writing books about it. And as people read our tradition, which we have guys that were allegedly representing that position, and we're seeing the stark contrast in many ways. I feel like men like this are now seeking to do this exegetical, historical, rational jujitsu in order to validate and vindicate their gatekeeping pillar voice distinctiveness. And we were talking about it a little bit online. Go ahead and speak to some of that. I think a lot of this retrieval and the assault on retrieval is less to do about theology and more to do about gatekeeping and legacy and prominence and power. What do you think?
Right. Well, I think, it's pretty evident in the coordination of the reactions to books that come out. You already mentioned Zachary Garris's book on feminism. Agree, disagree, whatever with Megan Basham, but the reaction to her book was nakedly coordinated. These guys think we're dumb, and we don't notice that they all use the same quotes and the same, things, and that they gang up and retweet each other and, kind of do all the same things. And it just because of our experience, I think, and of course, I think COVID has a lot to do with this. A lot of masks were lost during COVID. And I think we've seen as this is an old reference for some folk, but in the Wizard of Oz, when the when the curtain gets moved back and the big guy on the screen is telling us not to pay attention to the man, behind the curtain.
Nothing to see here.
There's a lot of that going on. And and so people are losing power and prestige and place, and people don't like it because they worked really hard to get some of those positions. Mm-hmm. They gave up things to get in those positions. And that's not true for all of them, but it's certainly the ethos, at least, that's being presented in a lot of what you're seeing in the response to guys. And again, whether or not that response is warranted is a separate question. But I have a little thing in my brain that goes off every time I see people in positions of authority and power speaking the same words at the same time.
Yeah. And what I also find fascinating about this is, so like, go a few years ago, what I noticed is like the going back to the Gospel Coalition's obsession with like statism and the state. I see the state and their platforms and their social media outlets obsessed about the BLM narrative, the woman abuse narrative, and the immigrant narrative. And here comes the progressive church, and they're all of a sudden at the same time parroting the language and sentiments of the state while tacking Bible verses on and thinking we're, like you said, we're stupid. So you don't think we notice that the media and the powers that be have been promoting this narrative all year long, and now you're Bibleizing it? Like, we're not dumb, And what I find funny is this Christian nationalism hoopla was not precipitated by the leadership of the church. This Christian nationalism hoopla and fear, it very much started in the culture. You started seeing like any Christian saying anything Christian about anything that went beyond liturgy. You saw like this paranoia in society, and you see like major media outlets talking about Christian nationalism. And all of a sudden now, around the same time, Ligon Duncan and all these guys are like, Christian nationalism. Like, do you think we're stupid? Mm. You don't think we notice that there's like this societal preoccupation that coincides with, and on top of that, the popularity of it. It's funny, like Reconstructionism and this kind of like post-millennial Christian national, whatever, it's been around for like the 60s, bro, like in the church. And you see like a book about it, right? Westminster gets together and they write a book against theonomy in the 90s, whatever. But like no one was like regularly obsessing about it. But now, because the media is talking about it, now because those people actually are being heard, it so happens to coincidentally be that Christians now are very concerned with it. And to me, the timing of it seems a bit peculiar. So anyways, I'll read one more quote and we'll close. So this is how he closes the article towards the end. As a minister in the PCA, and as one who takes vows to uphold the revised version of the Westminster Confession, I think the changes were for the better. But my aim in this article hasn't been so much to prove the changes were better, as it has been to show the changes are significant and that they represent two different and irreconcilable views of the civil magistrate. If American Presbyterians in particular want to look to their confessional past for a model of church-state relations, they'll have to determine if they're going to back to London or back to Philadelphia. They cannot be in both places at the same time. So we've talked a lot. There's only one more comment I want to tell everyone here. Look, if you are someone who subscribes to Westminster Standards, the only denials that you subscribe to are the denials in our standards. Our standards have denials, right? We deny things, right? That is what you subscribe to. What is not affirmed nor denied is not an issue of subscription. So for you to subscribe to 23.3 is not to confessionally deny 23.3 in the original standards. That's not. That's not subscription. What we're saying is that as a denomination, this is what is codified for us right here. But it is not to deny something else. That's important to realize, because this is what these guys are saying. If you subscribe to this, you need to renounce and deny that. Really? Why?
Right.
That's not true. But we've proven, I think, through the tradition or in America, through the conversation before America, through the standards themselves, that even in these changes, you're not denying the establishment principle wholesale, and you're not making constitutional voluntarism. You're not doing that. This is not that, and this is no slam dunk for that. Not even close. You better go back and do something else. This is not even close. Anyway, what were you going to say?
Yeah, it kind of my last thoughts on this. It would be incredibly ironic, and I'm not PCA, so I'm under different standards, but it would be incredibly ironic for the PCA or the OPC or whomever to become a denomination which enforces a view of the civil magistrate and makes it a term of communion when there is allowance for Sabbath breaking, an allowance for images of Christ, an allowance for other scruples and exceptions to the confession of faith. You would fundamentally, if you want to make this division between the first and second table, you would be fundamentally making a view of the fifth commandment more important than you would a view of the second commandment. And that would be a very interesting decision to make in light of other things.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Second is take it or leave it. Fourth, in many ways, is take it or leave it. Right. And even the third commandment is take it or leave it. I believe. I don't want to go into that whole conversation about oaths and vows, but I think there's a lot of things, and we're basically saying that our view of authority when it comes to the superiors of the magisterial realm, that is a deal breaker. That is like Todd Pruitt said in his podcast with Paul Truman, like we need to make sure that men who believe in the idea of Christ over a nation, we need to make sure we don't ordain them. Well, you know what? Like, I mean, to your point, and then some. You guys, listen. Like, whoever's hearing me, you're gonna need to hack up and change a lot more of the standards to make this clear-cut case for why we here in 2024 are constitutionally voluntarist with principal pluralism as the dogma of our confessionalism. Like, you're just going to need to go into the catechisms You're going to need to change 23:3 some more, change 23:1. It says that the civil magistrate is under Christ the King, the Lord, for piety and peace. You have first table and second. You're going to need to. The thing is, like, and here, Benjamin, would you agree that this is something that is so intrinsic to the system that if you really wanted to gut it from the system, you would have to scrap the entire system? Is that too much to say?
Well, I mean, you would certainly have to do more than minor surgery to deal with all of the threads that weave themselves through the standards.
Yeah, I think it's not. We need a Microsoft upgrade to me to remove this view of Christ's kingship over the civil sphere. It's intertwined with the law conversation. It's intertwined with the providence conversation. It's intertwined with the creation conversation. So I'm saying, like, part of our understanding of God's law and all of its first to tenness being the standards has a view of how Reformed people see creation, that the law of God is not administered on Sinai first, but in creation first. This connects to our view of creation. It's connected to our view of covenant. One covenant of grace infers that the moral law of God that would apply to society in the Old Testament under the administration of grace would have continuity in the new covenant administration of grace. So that there's a continuity conversation. You brought that up about how these Old Testament stuff, they just scrap it out. There's a freedom of conscience conversation. I mean, like, we don't believe that our confessions teach that freedom ever allows for people to be breaking the law of God. So in my mind, this is not going from Windows to a different Windows. This is going from Windows to Apple. It's a different system. Sure. So again, I feel like this assault on Christ's kingship here, whether guys know it or not, it is an assault on the crown comprehensively, I believe, because the crown is one crown. It has different diadems and it has different points, right? But they're all connected. And when you pull off one of those, it's attached to the other ones of those. And here's the thing, man, like, a lot of what this happens to is when Christians get out of the ecclesiological sphere, when Christians get out of liturgy, the crown of Christ exists conceptually. But so far as it entails for you to live your life via under that crown, societally, there is a discontinuity. And I think a lot of this conversation is related to a subversive antinomianism of the Christian outside of the ecclesiastical sphere. This is basically like, it's funny, like this whole two kingdoms, modern two kingdom stuff. Once you get into the creational, societal common realm, you are in this neutrality whereby a doxological external standard under Christ's kingship is somewhat set aside, and you can live your life however you want. And I've seen how this Christ over magistrate conversation, it affects Christians as they see God's law in the regular life. So this is about the Christian's obedience to Jesus as he sees his rule everywhere. And so I guess, to be fair to, like, the DeYoung crowd and the Pruitt crowd and the Brad Isbell crowd, they're concerned about guys like me, but I'm very concerned about guys like them. And hopefully these concerns spoken about, addressed, written about, challenged, would bring about who needs to be greatly concerned about which the most. But Benjamin, is it fair to say that history is on our side?
Well, I think that's fairly obvious. And also, I mean, that's part of the whole problem with a lot of the conversations we have right now is American Christians have ADHD. They can't think in centuries like our forefathers did.
Yeah.
And also, they can't pay attention to anything for more than 5 minutes. So, I mean, you not only had, and this is true for the Christian nationalism side as much as of the other, you have guys who pop up on Twitter that I've never heard of, and all of a sudden they have 10,000 followers, and they're the speaker for this, and then they're gone in like 6 months, and nobody hears from them again. And I mean, it's just a strange time we live in right now.
Yeah, but to me, I don't know. I feel like I would want to be in any other time than we are now. And I feel like, I don't know. You ever feel like I know you know it theologically, but like a lot of days I'm like, I was made to live in 2024.
Oh yeah.
And I'm glad I'm in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy it. But it is crazy. It is insane. It is insane. I mean, Christians for Kamala, like you got Christians for Kamala, and she's like having her party, and they're slaughtering kids at the party. Like, bro, that is insane. Like, and the Christian says, you know what? I'm not with the fact that like Democrats were celebrating their party by actually killing kids in the place where they were meeting. I'm not about that. I'm about, like, bro. And part, what part of this is due to is going back to why this is important. This apolitical, non-Christological view of the world that we live in that has made, the social political sphere pretty much this neutral zone where every immoral thing can get chalked up to its non-ecclesiastical, eschatological, whatever, bro. This is where it comes down to. Like, this is the fruits of this libertarian spirituality in the church. You can say whatever you want. You can say whatever you want about the issues of Christendom, historically speaking. But the issues of our day don't even begin to encroach the massive shadow of the depravity of what we see now. I mean, it's just crazy. It's insane. We kill more kids in a year by state sanctioning than probably the whole 30 years war over there. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Probably about 10 times over.
Yeah. But principal pluralism as a theological reformed position is indeed being fruitful, But anyways, we got to go. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Not a lot of guys would be bold enough to get on a podcast with me, bro. Well, I ask guys like
I live out in a strange world out here.
Yeah, so you're a bold guy. All right, Kingdom Polemics signing off. Don't scrap 1646 because of 1788. You can confess them both. I prefer the older version, but I don't believe that the newer version is canceling elements like this about the original. So anyways, I'm going to have an article on this. It has about 40 pages of content, more in depth, and it should be released soon. I'll tell you who it is. I guess you'll know who it is when it's out. Anyways, grace and peace, signing off, Kingdom Polemics.